essential thing in the 1970s in the world that Wałęsa was living was that people remembered the killings of 1970. They remembered the demands for free trade unions, and they hoped that at some point in the future things would change. In those same years, and I'm talking about the 60s and the 70s, the first signs of a coordinated dissident movement appeared in Poland. And there were two separate wings of it. Some of the dissidents emerged from within the Communist Party itself. People who were either members of the party or who were children of prominent communists who decided that the Soviet system was in no way true to the ideals which it continued to trumpet. And alongside that, there was a number of very small dissident organizations whose people tried to make symbolic protests and usually ended up in prison for minor offences which in the free world would not cause any eyelids to be raised. So some of the dissidents came from, as if you like, a communist background. Somebody like Adam Michnich was the son of a pre-war communist. He was a young activist who, in the 1960s, had the courage to stick his neck out and serve time in prison. On the other hand, there were other people who were, as it were, determined anti-communists from the start, and there was a long tradition of them. But there's one institution that can't be avoided in all these political matters, and that's the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was the only institution which had any measure of independence in Poland. It was headed by a magnificent primate, Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński, who was the person with the greatest authority of any in the land. And in 1956, Cardinal Wyszyński had come to an arrangement with the ruling Communist Party. Essentially, it was that if the Church did not openly oppose the state would allow space for religious practice and worship, which was quite unusual in the communist world. But it did mean that slowly the Roman Catholic Church became an umbrella, a shelter for all sorts of people who sought asylum in their own country for free discussions, for free artistic exhibitions, for all sorts of things which could only go on under the protection of the Church. The last of these, as it were, dissident organizations, the Roman Catholic Church can't be described as a dissident organization. It was much bigger than that, but it was a shelter, an asylum for dissidents. But in 1976, a workers' movement, a Committee for the Defense of Workers, was set up in Warsaw. And this was a very small body, of course, greatly disliked by the ruling authorities. And it had an interesting characteristic that it saw the need for intellectual dissidents, people who were analyzing the politics of the time and organizing protests and criticism, for them to join forces with, especially the workers, with the mass of the people who would essentially decide the future of the country. We now come to the question in the mid-70s of a major economic crisis in Poland. Edward Gierek, who I mentioned, the communist leader who came in 1970, was not your old-fashioned doctrinaire communist. He decided that the economy could best be rescued or developed in conjunction with the dreaded capitalist West. And to that end, he took a number of large-scale loans of money which were to be repaid by exporting goods for Poland. In other words, one of the communist states was moving towards integration with the world economy. This experiment all went wrong for a number of reasons. The communist technology proved incapable of producing goods which would be attractive on the foreign market. But equally, because of the oil crisis, the loans came under pressure, and Poland was required to repay loans, and that proved very difficult. And we moved into a period where the Polish economy was no longer meeting its basic goals. This is when the bread queues started, when prices began to rise very arbitrarily, and when repeated workers' protests took place about the deteriorating conditions. I see I've talked too long already. I shall get to the end soon. 1976, CORE, the Committee for the Defence of Workers, 1976-78, the first economic crises. 1978, the election of a Polish Pope, John Paul II. I think it's only people who lived through that who can remember the electrifying effect of that event, which had repercussions way beyond the ecclesiastical or the religious and spiritual sphere. John Paul II, who visited Poland in June 1979, never making a single word of criticism of the communist authorities, nonetheless demonstrated what genuine authority is. He was a man of great charisma. He was, of course, the head of the religion which most Poles belonged to. But he was an astonishing actor who attracted people's support and who showed what authority is all about. People only had to look at him, to listen to him, to realize that the system, the political system in which they were living, had no legitimacy, had no authority. It didn't deserve the respects that people were asking for. And I think that John Paul II was, the election of John Paul II was the trigger which created the climate in 1979 and 80 in which the Solidarity protest was extremely likely even before it happened. What did happen, and I'm sure other speakers have talked about this, was that a strike in the Lenin shipyards in Gdańsk, which started as a typical workers' strike for better conditions, then for a demand of the free trade unions which didn't exist, snowballed into a general rising, general national movement against the existing system. So that is, as it were, the last of the elements in the roots of solidarity, some of which go right back to insurrectionary traditions and some which are very much connected with the crisis of the 1970s. The particular catalyst in Gdańsk was a relatively minor event, something which happened every other day, namely a worker was fired. Usually such matters occurred in communist factories without any recourse at all. But on this occasion, the sacking of a woman crane driver called Anna Valentinovich, who incidentally was killed in the Smolensk air disaster this year. The sacking of this woman was the straw that broke the camel's back, brought the shipyard workers out on strike, and set the ball rolling in the direction we all know about. The leader of the strike was this half-educated electrician, Lech Wałęsa. Very unlikely character who climbed over the wall to not only join the strike but to act as its leader. And a man with no preparation or training who showed not only enormous courage but enormous skill as a negotiator, and as we know, he ran rings around the professional ministers who were sent to try and deal with him.